Do-do-do-do.
Sue sisters!
Do-do-do.
Sisters Sue!
Do-do-do-do.
Hey little Sues, welcome back to the Sue Sisters. Sister Susanna, what are we talking about today?
Well, Sister Susie, this week on episode 7 of our Anxious series, we're joined by some special guests. They are some of Canada's leading experts in psychedelic research and its connection to mental health.
That's right, today our guests will be discussing their research surrounding psilocybin mushrooms, which specializes in destigmatizing them for therapeutic use, specifically in socialized settings.
So let's welcome to the show the Mushroom Magicians.
Hey guys!
Hi, thanks for having us on the show.
It's great to have you here.
So to start off, our listeners may not be familiar with psilocybin mushrooms, so what are they?
Well, first of all, it's actually pronounced psilocybin.
Are you sure? Does that sound right to you, Sister Susie?
Well, we're the experts in this, so...
Anyway, to answer your question, your listeners may know them better as magic mushrooms. They are a naturally occurring psychedelic drug, which are mind-altering substances that can produce vivid hallucinations and intense emotional experiences. Psilocybin itself isn't psychoactive, but when the mushroom is ingested, our bodies break it down into psilocin, which causes these psychedelic effects.
Okay, so if these psychedelic drugs have such an impact on your mental state, how are they supposed to be beneficial for mental health conditions such as anxiety?
Well, their impact on our mental state goes hand in hand with their impact on our mental health. Both involve processes of the brain, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So as for their effect on mental health, clinical studies have shown that they have been successful in treating psychological and existential distress, particularly in patients receiving PTSD treatment or end-of-life care.
So from hallucinations to PTSD therapy, psilocybin can have different but profound effects on the functions of our brain.
Okay, so how do they actually affect the functions of the brain to produce these positive effects on mental health?
Well, this may be getting a little too scientific. Are you ready for it?
Sure, hit us with it.
So psilocybin has many positive impacts on the brain's neurotransmitters, neuroinflammation, and neuroplasticity.
Okay, hold up. Explain these concepts to us because I don't know about you, Sister Susie, but that sounded like a whole lot of gibberish to me.
We're on the same page there, Sister Susanna.
Okay, so first of all, neurotransmitters are responsible for the transmission of serotonin, which you may know as the happy hormone. Serotonin is boosted through things like a healthy diet, exercise, and sunlight exposure.
Yeah, so how does psilocybin do this?
Well, it acts as a kind of replacement for the lack of serotonin, and therefore improves and regulates mood.
Okay, that's making more sense. How about neuroinflammation and what was it again?
Neuroplasticity?
Yeah, that's it.
Well, neuroinflammation is the inflammation of the brain which can be caused by stress, and neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to learn and adjust. So by boosting serotonin and regulating mood, this then leads to a reduction in neuroinflammation and an increase in neuroplasticity.
And on top of this, psilocybin has a low risk factor, meaning it is not highly addictive like other medications.
So if these psychedelics are so helpful, why are they still illegal in most contexts?
Well, there is still a lot of stigma surrounding psychedelic use, and to understand why, we have to go into the history of it.
Okay, so when was it first used?
Well, psilocybin mushrooms have been used for centuries by indigenous cultures, but it wasn't really until the early 20th century that they started to enter Western science. This interest was sparked when scientist Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in 1938.
What was the early research looking at?
For the most part, early research was looking into the medical potentials of psychedelics as a treatment method, and also used psychedelics as a model for psychosis. A lot of this early research did show a lot of promise, but by the 50s and 60s, when research was at its peak, results were overshadowed by growing concerns over its recreational use and lack of standardized study protocols.
Unfortunately, there were also a lot of unethical experiments being done at this time. For example, the CIA was trying to link psychedelics with mind control, and the media caught hold of this, along with other experiments and sensationalized psychedelics, which ultimately led to a lot of social concern and fear regarding these drugs.
Wow, this sounds like an episode of Stranger Things.
That's what I was gonna say.
So what happened after this?
By the end of the 60s, there was a lot of political tension, and psychedelics became politically charged as they started being linked with counterculture and anti-establishment movements. Media continued feeding into public fear, linking their use to delinquency and psychosis, further justifying government suppression and increasing stigma.
Okay, that explains the stigma surrounding it. But how did it become illegal?
So Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971, in which he enacted the Controlled Substances Act and classified psychedelics as a Schedule I substance. For those listeners who don't know, Schedule I drugs are the most restricted drug class and are considered to have a high potential for abuse with no accepted medical use. This legislation effectively halted most research as it made these substances illegal, and also reinforced the narrative that psychedelics are a dangerous countercultural threat rather than a potential therapeutic tool.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, it is also important to note that Nixon's policies to fight the war on drugs disproportionately targeted marginalized communities, and the government's focus on policing and suppressing drug use in these communities led to further stigmatization of substances that had deep cultural roots in non-Western societies, such as Indigenous communities.
So, with all this stigma, what has caused the recent psychedelic renaissance?
Well, it is no secret that we are facing a mental health crisis on a global scale, and because of this, the exploration of alternate therapeutic methods, including psilocybin use, returned to mainstream science in the early 2000s.
This has been carried out mainly through clinical studies, and as a result, legislation has started to shift, meaning that psychedelics aren't as restricted in certain contexts, specifically clinical and medical contexts for PTSD treatment.
But I see that your research focuses on the possibilities of transitioning use to more socialized, naturalistic settings rather than clinical. So tell us a bit about that.
Well, psilocybin mushrooms have a long history outside of clinical contexts. They have been traditionally used within Indigenous cultures across the globe for centuries.
Yes, we saw in your research that one of the studies explained that psychedelics, quote, have a long history of safe use among Indigenous cultures of the Americas and Eurasia, unquote.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Indigenous cultures spanning from Mexico to India have used them safely in socialized contexts for a long time, mainly for therapeutic and spiritual purposes. However, as briefly mentioned earlier, this was either dismissed or contributed to the stigmatization of psilocybin use because of the colonial and racialized prejudices ingrained in Western society.
That makes a lot of sense considering Canada and America's colonial history. It's very important to honor Indigenous ways of knowing and to look at the cultural origins of such practices to inform how we can use them today. So, on this note, how do these cultural and socialized uses continue today?
Well, the study that Sister Susie mentioned earlier looked into this specifically. The researchers, Oscar Vallis Garcia and Marcos Dominic Cid, examined the patterns of psychedelic use within Latin American contexts. To do this, they conducted a survey with 4,270 participants from several Latin American countries, asking questions related to their motivations and behaviors surrounding psychedelic use.
So, what did the study find?
Well, they found that the most used psychedelic was psilocybin mushrooms. The primary purpose for use was the psychological well-being experienced during use, and the most favored context for use were in the participants' own homes or outdoors.
Okay, very interesting. What does this mean for your research?
Well, first of all, it shows us that overall, psychedelics had a positive effect on the mental health of participants and was the main motivation for use. It also shows us that psilocybin mushrooms are the most widely used psychedelic in the Latin American context, despite legal restrictions and stigmatization. This indicates to us that because people are already using them so much, they need to be more researched and destigmatized to ensure they are used safely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how about the socialized uses?
Well, it showed us that participants found it more beneficial using the drug outside of clinical settings, particularly at homes or outdoors.
Yeah, I think I would feel the same. Taking mushrooms in a clinical setting seems a bit scary to me. I feel like I would feel a lot more free and comfortable in my own space.
Yeah, you're not the only one. This is also the case with two psychedelic users, Jurea and Musfira, in the chapter Tripping in Karachi, exploring the intersection of gender and its fluidity through psychedelic substances from the book Expanding Mindscapes. Jurea felt safer exploring their gender and sexuality through psychedelics within their home, and Musfira felt a deep connection to the earth and a separation from gender by taking psychedelics in nature. These cultural uses and contexts show us how the use of psilocybin mushrooms in more natural, personal settings has deep cultural roots and can be more beneficial for users.
That all sounds very ideal, but what are the potential dangers of this transition?
Well, the danger is that we don't know for sure what all the potential risks are. While research on psychedelic use is growing due to the recent psychedelic renaissance, scientists warn us that there is still a significant lack of in-depth research on psilocybin's effects, especially for the use in social and cultural settings.
Also, while there is a fair amount of case studies and research on psilocybin use for a few mental illnesses, such as depression and PTSD, it has not been extensively tested on other mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder. Effects also vary from person to person because our brains are all structured and function differently. So overall, the research is not well-rounded and there are no guaranteed benefits for all types of mental health issues, which is why further research is so important.
Yeah, it's important to assess all the risks as well as all the benefits. Well, this conversation has been really insightful. But one final question for you guys. Why do you think it is important to minimize the stigma behind psilocybin mushrooms?
Psilocybin mushrooms have the potential to be extremely beneficial as a mental illness treatment, whether that is in a clinical or recreational context. The stigma surrounding it is preventing that potential from being harnessed, as well as preventing further, more thorough research on it from being conducted. Despite research showing positive effects and possibilities of beneficial psilocybin use, without further research it cannot be used with 100% safety, nor can it be destigmatized because of the lack of knowledge surrounding it. Our research hopes to minimize the stigma behind psilocybin mushrooms by highlighting the need for more research on the subject due to the evidence that suggests its potential.
How interesting. The Sue sisters agree. More research is definitely needed. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you so much to our guests, the Mushroom Magicians.
Thank you for having us.
Before we part ways, the Sue sisters would just like to issue our routine reminder that Susie and I are not experts on these subjects, and we are not promoting the use of any treatments, psychedelics, or medications mentioned in our podcast. Please do your own research and speak to medical professionals if you would like to know more about psilocybin mushrooms.
Thank you for tuning in. Sue Sisters out.
Doodly-doo-doo.
Sue Sisters!
Doodly-doo-doo.
Sister Sue!
Doodly-doo.